think about your day so far. Chances are you've already made a dozen calculations about risk without even realizing it.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. Maybe you thought about the financial risk of a new investment, or the health risk of skipping your workout, or even the career risk of speaking up in a morning meeting.
We constantly weigh these
We
things.
do. We talk about risk every single day. We are surrounded by it. We try to manage it. We mitigate it. But have you ever stopped to ask yourself what risk actually is?
And that is the crucial question.
Not just how to avoid it or, how to buy insurance against it, but what the concept itself truly means for us as a society. Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are looking at a thoroughly comprehensive source. It's Stefan Popov's 2026 book, The Risk Dimension: Sociological Theories, Conceptual Paradigm, and Policy Application.
Which is quite a title.
It is a mouthful, but I promise you, this is not a textbook about actuarial tables. It is a really profound look at how human beings conceptualize the unknown.
It is. And the ambition of Popov's work is precisely what makes it so compelling. We're going to deconstruct the very concept of risk by tracing its evolution through four major sociological frameworks.
Right.
The goal isn't just to define risk on a piece of paper, but to understand why modern society has become utterly obsessed with it. And we should establish right away that Popov isn't just an armchair theorist.
No, not at all.
He's drawing from a decade of high-level policy projects dealing with incredibly complex real-world scenarios. I mean, he's analyzing the structural responses to the COVID-19 crisis, the mechanics of states of emergency, the shadow networks of transnational organized crime, and geopolitical volatility.
Yeah, specifically looking at Russia's behavior post-Crimea, which is a massive case study in his book.
Exactly. He takes all of that practical high-stakes weight and uses it to actually test these sociological theories.
And that practical grounding is crucial because when you start talking about sociological theory, it's really easy to get lost in the clouds.
Very easy.
But Popov anchors it. He actually starts with a historical premise that sounds completely counterintuitive at first glance. He points out that in ancient times, people didn't actually have a modern concept of risk at all.
Which sounds absurd, right?
It does, because life in antiquity was infinitely more dangerous than it is now. I mean, if you read classical literature like Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey, the characters are constantly navigating extreme, life-threatening situations.
Constant peril.
Right. Odysseus is anticipating the threat of mythical monsters, navigating treacherous seas, dealing with angry gods. Back home, Penelope is creatively managing the threat of aggressive suitors trying to usurp Ithaca. King Priam is agonizing over the very survival of Troy. The danger is ubiquitous. But Popov argues they aren't practicing risk management.
They aren't. Because their conceptual framework for dealing with the future was entirely different from ours. Classical and pre-modern texts view danger through a highly syncretic lens.
Meaning everything is blended together.
Right. The threats they face are inextricably mixed with concepts of gods, fate, morality, divine providence. If a storm destroys a Greek merchant ship, it's not viewed as a statistical probability of age and weather patterns.
Like a 15% chance of a gale?
Exactly. No, it's interpreted as Poseidon's wrath. Perhaps it's retribution for hubris or a failure to make the proper sacrifices. The cause and effect are moral and divine. They aren't mathematical. To arrive at our modern concept of risk, society had to undergo a massive, centuries-long transformation. Max Weber famously called this the disenchantment of the world.
The disenchantment of the world, meaning the process of secularization where the world is stripped of its magical or mystical explanations.
Yes. The world is no longer explained by divine forces, but by rational, observable processes. But the consequence of that disenchantment is what matters for our deep dive today. It fundamentally altered human time perception.
How so?
Well, for pre-modern societies, the future was largely predetermined by higher powers. Your fate was written. But once the future was no longer viewed as written by divine providence, humanity was suddenly forced to take its future into its own hands.
You're on our own.
Exactly. Making decisions about a completely unknown and unwritten future is the very birthplace of modern risk. Risk only exists because the safety net of fate has been removed, and we have choices to make about tomorrow.
I want to linger on that shift for a second because it's really profound when you think about it. We moved from praying to the gods for a safe voyage to drawing up maritime insurance contracts and calculating the probability of a shipwreck based on seasonal data.
We replaced faith with math.
We replaced faith with math. And that reliance on math and measurability leads us straight into the early 20th century. Specifically, the work of an economist named Frank Knight and his 1921 seminal book, risk, uncertainty, and profit. Knight is really the godfather of how we attempt to quantify the unknown.
He is. Knight is the essential starting point for modern risk theory because he establishes a boundary that almost everyone else either builds on or reacts against. He draws a really hard line between uncertainty and risk.
Which we usually just use interchangeably.
In everyday language, sure, we use those words to mean the same thing. But for Knight, they are entirely distinct phenomena.
Let's clearly define that boundary for everyone. Knight argues that uncertainty is a fundamental, irreducible reality of human existence. It is the raw, unmeasurable unknown. Risk, on the other hand, is what he calls measurable uncertainty.
Measurable uncertainty.
Right. It is a specific, domesticated type of uncertainty that we have managed to tame using the mathematical tools of probability. If you can assign a mathematical probability to an unknown outcome, say, a 15% chance of a market downturn based on historical data, it's a risk. If you cannot assign a probability to it because it's unprecedented or just completely chaotic, it remains radical uncertainty.
And he didn't arrive at this distinction in a vacuum. Knight was actually mounting an audacious critique of classical science, specifically how it was being misapplied to human economics and society.
Oh, this is the physics envy part.
Yes. He looked back at the scientific giants, Galileo, Descartes, Newton, and he analyzed their methodology. Classical mechanics relies on invisible, abstract concepts like force or gravity to create a very neat deterministic picture of nature. It creates a universe where everything is a predictable, uninterrupted chain of cause and effect.
If you drop an apple, you know exactly where it's going to go.
Right. If you drop a physical weight, you can calculate exactly when and where it will land.
Newton gives us this beautiful mathematical clockwork universe. And economists in Knight's era were essentially experiencing physics envy. They were trying to apply that same deterministic clockwork math to the stock market, to human businesses, to social behavior. They wanted economics to be as predictable as astronomy.
But Knight points out that when you try to apply classical mathematical certainty to human beings, the model shatters. Human motivations, subjective desires, social panics, these aren't physical objects that can be weighed or mapped on a Cartesian plane.
They aren't apples falling from a tree.
Exactly. Therefore, true uncertainty in human affairs is irreducible. You cannot fully mathematically model the future of a society because humans are not clockwork gears. They are erratic, emotional, and capable of generating entirely new, unprecedented behaviors.
But wait, practically speaking, in a modern financial market or in contemporary geopolitics, aren't those two lines entirely blurred? I mean, if we look at one of Popov's examples analyzing Russia's behavior post-Crimea, how can geopolitical analysts ever confidently say they've moved something from uncertainty into risk? They run thousands of war games and statistical models to assign probabilities to Putin's next move. But isn't that just dressing up radical uncertainty in a tailored suit of mathematics?
That is exactly Knight's underlying point, and Popov leans heavily into it. When intelligence agencies or financial analysts assign a specific probability to a geopolitical event, they are often suffering from an illusion of precision.
An illusion of precision. I like that.
Knight argued that you can only calculate true risk when you have a vast pool of identical past events to draw from, like flipping a coin a million times or calculating mortality rates for a life insurance company based on millions of lives. But historical events are unique. There is no large sample size for a post-Crimea geopolitical landscape. It is a singular event.
Right. It's never happened exactly like this before.
Exactly. So when analysts assign a 35% probability to a specific military escalation, they aren't actually measuring risk in the strict Knightian sense. They are making an educated guess masquerading as objective math. They are dealing with radical uncertainty.
And Knight goes even further to show how inescapable this uncertainty is by introducing this really mind-bending paradox about problem solving. He essentially says that even the act of solving a problem is steeped in radical uncertainty, because you cannot predict the solution to a problem before you actually solve it.
Right, because if you could
predict the solution, you would already possess it, and therefore it wouldn't be a problem anymore.
It's a brilliant epistemological trap. It means that human progress itself is an engine of uncertainty. You cannot forecast what innovations will emerge tomorrow, because to forecast an innovation requires having already innovated it. This is why long-term economic or technological forecasting is so fraught. We are constantly trying to put a mathematical band-aid on a reality that is fundamentally unknowable.
So the takeaway from Knight isn't just a neat definition for an economics textbook. Popov uses Knight to show that risk is, at its core, a sociological construct. We create the concept of risk and we use math to measure it because we're desperately trying to avoid acknowledging the terrifying, radical uncertainty of the universe. Calling something a risk gives us an illusion of control. It allows us to sleep at night.
Precisely. Because if we accept that the future is radically uncertain, it leads to paralysis. Institutions can't function, governments can't plan budgets, individuals can't make long-term investments. The language of risk and the mathematics of probability, they function as a necessary societal fiction. It's a mechanism that allows us to operate in the present by pretending we have a handle on the future.
But if we are just drawing somewhat arbitrary lines around uncertainty to create this concept of risk, it begs a massive question. Who decides where the line is drawn? What is considered a manageable risk versus an existential threat? That is inherently subjective.
Very subjective.
Which brings us to the 1980s and the work of anthropologist Mary Douglas. In 1983, she co-authored a book with Aaron Wildavsky called Risk and Culture. And she takes Knight's idea that risk is a construct and pushes it to its absolute philosophical limit.
She certainly does, and her work is highly polarizing. Mary Douglas argues that there is no such thing as an objective theory of risk. You cannot separate a risk from the society that is perceiving it. For Douglas, risk is entirely a political and cultural concept. What one society, or even one subgroup within a society, views as a terrifying risk, another group might view as perfectly acceptable. Or they might just ignore it completely.
Because it doesn't threaten their specific way of life.
Right. She argues that we don't assess risk based on raw data. We assess it based on our social organization.
To explain how this works, Douglas and Wildavsky created a structural sociology matrix. It maps out how different societies or different cultural tribes perceive risk. They call it the grid group analysis. And rather than getting bogged down in the mechanics of the axes, let's focus on the 4 distinct cultural archetypes that this matrix produces. Because when you look at these 4 portraits, they perfectly describe the political and social fractures we see today, especially when you apply them to something like the COVID-19 pandemic, which Popov specifically analyzes.
What's fascinating here is that the grid group analysis is arguably one of the most powerful tools for understanding public policy failures. The 4 archetypes are defined by 2 things: how bound an individual is to a community that's the group axis, and how constrained they are by rules and hierarchies, which is the grid axis.
Let's break those down.
Let's start with the individualist. This is low group, low grid. This is someone who's not bound tightly to a collective community, and they deeply resent rigid rules or regulations. Think of a free market libertarian or a tech entrepreneur. To the individualist, risk is not inherently negative. It is an opportunity.
High risk, high reward.
Exactly. They view nature as resilient and the market as self-correcting. During a crisis like COVID-19, Popov shows how the individualist minimizes the biological risk of the virus, but maximizes the economic risk of lockdowns and government overreach. They fear regulation far more than they fear a pathogen.
Right. They look at the data and say, the risk to my health is relatively low, but the risk to my business from these government mandates is catastrophic. Then you have the second archetype, the fatalist. This is low group, high grid. This person is highly constrained by external rules and circumstances, but they lack the support network of a tight-knit community. They feel isolated and controlled by a system they have no power over. For the fatalist, risk is just bad luck. It's fate. They don't feel they have any agency to mitigate it, so they don't even try.
They just accept it.
Yeah. During a pandemic, the fatalist might say, if I get it, I get it. The system is rigged anyway and nothing I do matters. They distrust the government, but they also distrust their neighbors.
Then you move to the hierarchist. This is high group, high grid. This group has high community loyalty, but also deep respect for rigid rules, authority, and established institutions. Think of a military structure, a traditional corporate environment, or traditional institutionalists. The hierarchist believes the world is dangerous, but that risks can be effectively managed and controlled as long as everyone follows the rules and defers to credentialed experts.
So during the pandemic, the hierarchist is the one saying, listen to the CDC, follow the protocols, wear the mask, stand 6 feet apart.
Exactly. To them, the greatest risk isn't the virus itself, but the social disorder caused by people breaking the rules. Deviance is the ultimate threat.
And finally, we have the egalitarian. High group, low grid. They have intense loyalty to their group, but they actively reject top-down authority and rigid internal hierarchies. They operate on consensus and shared moral values. Because they lack formal institutional rules to bind them together, they often maintain their group cohesion by focusing intensely on an external threat.
An enemy on the outside keeps them united on the inside.
Precisely. They view nature as fragile and easily corrupted by human interference. To the egalitarian, the greatest risks are those created by greedy corporations or corrupt systems that threaten the marginalized or the environment. During COVID-19, the egalitarian is hyper-focused on the vulnerability of the community. They demand strict collective action, not just for personal safety, but as a moral imperative to protect the weakest members. Anyone who refuses to participate is viewed not just as a rule breaker, but as morally corrupt.
And when you lay out those four archetypes, it completely demystifies why public debates about risk are so toxic and unproductive. You can have an individualist, a hierarchist, and an egalitarian all looking at the exact same epidemiological data or the exact same climate change report, and they will come to completely contradictory conclusions about what the data means and what policy should be implemented.
Because they aren't arguing about the data, they are arguing about their cosmology. They are defending their way of life.
Precisely. Douglas points out that when we select certain risks to worry about, we are actually selecting which social structure we want to defend. The egalitarian highlights the risk of corporate pollution to justify tighter regulations and rein in the free market. The individualist highlights the risk of economic stagnation to justify deregulation. The risk assessment is just a weaponized narrative used to defend a cultural worldview.
I have to push back a little on Mary Douglas here, though. Doesn't this level of cultural relativism become dangerous? I mean, is she really saying that a nuclear meltdown or a highly lethal virus is just a cultural construct? Surely there is a baseline of objective physical danger that exists regardless of whether you are an individualist or an egalitarian.
That is the most common critique of Mary Douglas. And it's important to clarify that she isn't denying the physical reality of a virus or a nuclear meltdown. What she's saying is that the physical reality alone does not dictate our social response. The meaning we assign to the physical event, the level of panic it induces, and the specific mitigations we are willing to tolerate those are entirely culturally constructed. A virus is a biological fact, but whether you shut down the global economy for a year to stop it is a cultural choice based on how you prioritize competing risks.
And this leads Douglas and Wildavsky to a profound conclusion about human action, which they articulate as a paradox. They ask, can we know the risks we face? And their answer is, no, we cannot. But yes, we must act as if we do.
It's a devastating critique of modern technocracy. Because our knowledge of the future is always culturally biased by our grid group positioning, and because true Nietzschean uncertainty is irreducible, our grand objective risk reduction programs usually fail to prevent the worst damage.
We're just guessing.
We take massive leaps in the dark every day. But survival forces us to act. A government cannot paralyze itself, waiting for perfect objective data that will never arrive. We have to build power grids, we have to formulate foreign policy, we have to navigate pandemics. So we construct a cultural narrative of risk, we dress it up in statistics, and we act as if we possess objective knowledge of the future.
It's a sobering thought. We are basically feeling our way through a dark room, pretending we have a flashlight. But Douglas's focus on cultural tribes perceiving different risks sets the stage perfectly for our next shift. What happens when a risk emerges that is so massive, so apocalyptic, that it shatters those cultural boundaries entirely? We are moving to the epical, historical shift described by the German sociologist Ulrich Beck. His concept of the risk society is arguably the most famous sociological framework of the last few decades.
It is. And Beck's theory, unlike Douglas's cultural matrix, is deeply rooted in a specific historical timeline and a specific trauma. Popov notes that Beck experienced a profound, visceral reaction to the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear disaster. For Beck, Chernobyl wasn't just a localized engineering failure. It was an anthropological shock. It proved that the fundamental nature of the threats facing humanity had evolved into something entirely new.
To map this evolution, Beck divides human history into a three-part schema. First, you have pre-modern societies. These are agrarian, focused on tradition, where the primary threats are natural disasters or famines, which, as we discussed earlier, were viewed as acts of God or nature.
Right.
Second, you have classical modernity. This encompasses the Industrial Revolution, the rise of powerful nation-states, capitalism, and a deep, almost religious belief in scientific progress. In classical modernity, the goal is to conquer nature and produce wealth. But Beck argues that classical modernity has exhausted itself, and we have entered the third phase, second modernity, which he calls the risk society.
The transition from classical modernity into the risk society is marked by a massive structural inversion of what society is organized around. In the industrial age, society was primarily consumed by the distribution of goods. The great political, social, and class struggles of the 19th and 20th centuries were about who gets the wealth, who gets the jobs, who owns the means of production, who gets the resources.
It was a fight over the spoils of progress.
Exactly. But in the risk society, the core organizing principle flips. Society is now organized around the distribution of bads.
The distribution of bads. That reframes everything. We aren't just fighting over money anymore. We are fighting over who has to absorb the toxic byproducts of our civilization. Who has to live next to the chemical plant? Who suffers from the microplastics in the water? Who bears the brunt of rising sea levels, nuclear fallout, or the unpredictable ripples of globalized financial crashes?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the crucial insight Beck offers is how these bads are generated. The apocalyptic scale risks of the second modernity are not coming from external nature. They are the direct result of our own industrial success.
The success itself is the threat.
Yes. In classical modernity, science and technology were the absolute saviors. They cured diseases and lifted millions out of poverty. But in the risk society, science and technology are the primary engines generating catastrophic risk. The more we modernize, the more we endanger ourselves. Climate change is the ultimate example. It is not an act of God. It is the accumulated side effect of 2 centuries of industrial triumph. The system is producing side effects that it no longer has the capacity to control.
And the nature of these manufactured risks is fundamentally different. Beck points out that they are invisible. You can't see radiation. You can't see the complex financial derivatives that tanked the global economy in 2008. You can't see carbon accumulating in the atmosphere.
You only see the aftermath.
Right. And because these risks are invisible and highly complex, we're entirely dependent on scientists and experts to even tell us that we are in danger, which creates a bizarre paradox where we have to rely on the exact same scientific institutions that created the risk in the first place to save us from it.
And that dependency breeds immense public anxiety and distrust, which plays right back into Mary Douglas's cultural fractures that we just discussed. But Beck introduces another concept that explains exactly why modern life, on an individual level, feels so incredibly stressful.
Yeah.
He calls it individualization.
Yes, this is the part of Beck's theory that really hits home for the listener. In the past, people had traditional safety nets. Your social class, your fixed gender roles, your extended family, your lifelong career at a single corporation. These structures were rigid, sure, but they absorbed a massive amount of life's inherent risks. They dictated your path. But in the risk society, those traditional institutions and safety nets have largely dissolved.
The dissolution of those structures forces the individual to navigate what Beck calls an experimental life. You are now expected to design your own biography. You have to chart your own career path in a gig economy. You have to manage your own retirement investments in a volatile market. You have to navigate complex healthcare choices.
It's all on you.
Exactly. The crushing burden of massive systemic risks is shifted away from the state and the community and placed squarely on your individual shoulders. You, the individual, are personally held responsible for surviving systemic failures that you had no part in creating.
It's the ultimate neoliberal trap. If the economy crashes and you lose your gig work income, society tells you that you should have upskilled or you should have diversified your income streams. We individualize systemic risks. It feels incredibly bleak. We are all just isolated actors trying to dodge invisible apocalyptic threats. But Popov highlights that Beck actually finds a strange forced optimism in all of this, right?
He does. Beck is not a pure fatalist. He introduces the idea of the cosmopolitan moment. His logic is that the defining risks of the second modernity, like a global viral pandemic, the shifting climate, or the fallout from a nuclear meltdown, they do not respect national borders. A virus doesn't care about the lines drawn on a map. Climate change doesn't spare a wealthy nation while destroying a developing one, at least not in the long run. The risks are completely transnational.
And because these risks are universally threatening, they force us to look past our local divisions.
Exactly. They create a forced global solidarity. This is the cosmopolitan moment. To survive these apocalyptic bads, humanity is absolutely forced to cooperate with the other. We have to look past old geopolitical borders and what Beck calls the zombie categories of the past.
I love that phrase, zombie categories. Concepts like strict nationalism or the Cold War binary of East versus West, or outdated class structures that are functionally dead but still staggering around, eating up political discourse.
Right. Beck argues that the sheer scale of modern risk forces a cosmopolitan unity simply out of shared necessity. A nation cannot solve climate change or a pandemic unilaterally. It requires a globally coordinated response.
But let's look at the reality of that for a second. During COVID-19, did we actually see a cosmopolitan moment? Because from where I sat, while there was some global scientific cooperation on vaccines, we also saw intense vaccine nationalism, borders snapping shut, and countries hoarding medical supplies. It felt less like a global brotherhood and more like a chaotic scramble for lifeboats.
That is a very valid critique, and it points to the tension in Beck's work. The cosmopolitan moment is perhaps better understood as a necessity rather than an inevitability. Beck is outlining what is structurally required to survive the risk society. Whether human political systems are actually capable of achieving that cosmopolitan unity before the risks overwhelm us is a totally open question.
And that question of who controls the response leads us directly into part 4. If a massive global threat emerges, who gets to define it, and how is that threat narrative used to manage us? We are turning to the ideas of the French philosopher Michel Foucault.
It's important to clarify, as Popov does, that Foucault himself didn't write a specific, dedicated theory of risk. However, his followers, particularly a sociologist named François Ewald, built a highly influential theory of risk based entirely on Foucault's concepts of power, specifically his concept of governmentality.
To understand governmentality, we have to look at how Foucault mapped out the evolution of power over the last few centuries. He essentially describes a progression through 3 different modalities of power.
Let's walk through them.
The first is sovereignty. Think of a medieval king, or Machiavelli's The Prince. In this era, power is a blunt theatrical instrument. It is about a ruler demanding obedience under the threat of direct violence, torture, or death. The sovereign doesn't care much about the daily habits, the health, or the education of the subjects, as long as they pay taxes and don't revolt. The only true risk in the sovereignty model is the existential threat to the ruler's throne.
The second modality is discipline, which emerges strongly in the 17th and 18th centuries. Power realizes that constantly using blunt, public violence is inefficient and often sparks rebellion. Instead, power begins to target individual physical bodies to make them productive and obedient, what Foucault calls docile bodies.
This is where we get the rise of the modern institutions that watch and shape us.
Yes. The paradigmatic example Foucault uses is Jeremy Bentham's panopticon. It's a prison design where a central guard tower can watch all the inmates, but the inmates can never see the guards. Because the inmates never know exactly when they are being observed, they police their own behavior.
It's internalized control.
Exactly. This disciplinary power relies on constant surveillance and normalization. But it's not just prisons. Foucault argues this disciplinary logic becomes the structure of schools, hospitals, military barracks, and factories. It enforces societal norms and efficiency without the direct, bloody violence of the sovereign. It controls the individual by isolating, observing, and correcting them.
But then we get to the modern era, and the third modality, governmentality. And here's where it gets really interesting. This is where the concept of risk truly explodes as a political tool.
In the modern era, power shifts its focus away from micromanaging the individual docile body. You cannot manage a complex national economy of millions of people by putting everyone in a disciplinary panopticon. It's too restrictive. Instead, governmentality takes the population as its target. It relies on statistics, birth rates, public health data, employment figures, and economic indicators. It is what Foucault famously called the conduct of conduct.
The conduct of conduct. Meaning the state doesn't force you to do something with a sword at your throat. It shapes the environment so you freely choose to do what the state wants you to do. Yeah. It's the ultimate soft power.
Precisely. Governmentality actually requires the free will and the liberty of citizens to operate effectively. A liberal democracy manages its population by subtly shaping behaviors, incentivizing healthy choices, managing the economy to prevent mass unrest, and using statistics to predict and control macro trends. It regulates the flow of society rather than disciplining every individual drop of water.
Okay, so how does risk fit into this framework of soft power? Popov shares a famous, almost shocking quote from François Ewald, who is building on Foucault. Ewald said, "Nothing is a risk in itself. There is no risk in reality."
It sounds absurd at first, doesn't it? If a hurricane is bearing down on your city, of course that's a risk. But Ewald is making a profound point about epistemology and governance. He's arguing that risk is not a physical object existing out in nature. Risk is a perspective. It is a discursive lens, a specific way of framing reality that is actively used by institutions to manage population.
Wait, let me make sure I have this right. Are you saying the virus isn't a risk? Or a terrorist attack isn't a risk?
The virus is a biological reality. The terrorist attack is a physical event of violence. But the framework of risk, The mathematical modeling, the color-coded threat levels, the public health mandates, the daily statistics broadcast on the news, that entire apparatus is a political technology. Think about how a modern liberal democracy operates. It cannot use the raw violence of the sovereign to force everyone to stay home, and it can't put everyone in a disciplinary prison. But if the state defines a situation, say a pandemic, a terrorist threat, or an economic downturn as a massive calculable risk to the population, it suddenly has the justification to intervene intimately in our lives.
Ah, I see. The state uses the language of risk to justify actions that would otherwise be seen as tyrannical.
Exactly. Look at Popov's example of states of emergency or the response to transnational organized crime. By defining these as systemic risks, the state can freeze bank accounts, mandate medical procedures, ground international flights, and conduct mass digital surveillance. The idea of risk is the tool the state uses to enforce public health mandates, conduct security sweeps, and maintain social order, all while claiming it is merely acting rationally to protect the population's welfare. Risk is the ultimate technology of modern governance because it depoliticizes control. It makes state intervention look like objective math rather than an exercise of power.
That completely flips how you read the news. Every time a new risk is announced by a government agency, Foucault would have us ask, not just what is the danger, but how is this narrative being used to shape our behavior? What new surveillance or control is being justified in the name of risk mitigation? It's a brilliant, somewhat cynical lens. But it assumes there is a central authority, a state, a government, a cabal of experts consciously pulling the levers of governmentality. What if there isn't? What if nobody is actually in charge? That brings us to our final sociological framework, Niklas Luhmann's systems theory. Luhmann completely flips the script on what society even is.
Luhmann is notoriously complex, but his core idea is a radical departure from everything we've discussed so far. Traditionally, we think of society as a collection of human beings interacting with each other. Luhmann says no. Society is not made of people. Society is communication. For Luhmann, human individuals with our brains, our bodies, our psychologies are completely outside the social system. We are merely the environment in which the social system operates. Society is an autonomous, self-generating network of communications.
So politics is just a system of communication. The economy is a system of communication. The legal system, the education system, they're all just closed loops of communication.
Yes, and these social systems operate on a principle Luhmann borrowed from theoretical biology called autopoiesis, which means self-reproduction. A biological cell must constantly reproduce itself and its internal processes to stay alive. Similarly, the legal system must continuously generate new laws, new lawsuits, and new verdicts to maintain its existence. The economic system must constantly generate prices, payments, and transactions. If the communication stops, the system dies.
And because these systems are constantly hurtling into an unknown future, they are forced to make decisions. The legal system has to rule on unprecedented technologies. The political system has to react to sudden crises. They have to keep communicating, keep deciding to stay alive. And this is where Luhmann makes a crucial, highly practical contribution to the language of risk. Popov highlights that we constantly misuse the words risk and danger as if they mean the exact same thing. But for Luhmann, they are entirely different concepts.
This distinction is perhaps the most useful takeaway for analyzing institutional behavior. Luhmann defines danger as an external factor that causes harm. You do not choose it. It simply happens to you from the environment. A meteor strike is a danger. An earthquake is a danger. A completely unprecedented mutated virus leaping to humans in a remote forest is a danger.
But a risk is fundamentally tied to a decision.
Yes. If an adverse outcome is the result of a decision you made, or a decision a system made, it is a risk. Let's use an example. If you decide to build a nuclear power plant on an active fault line, the earthquake itself is a danger, its external nature. But the resulting nuclear meltdown and the destruction of the surrounding city is a risk because it stems directly from the decision to build the plant there. Risk is the potential for an adverse outcome that is attributed to a choice.
So, this raises an important question. If Luhmann says that risk is tethered to decisions, why does modern society prefer to view almost every misfortune as a risk rather than a danger? Why do we shy away from saying things are just fate or bad luck or acts of God? Why are we so eager to claim ownership of the bad things that happen?
It goes right back to the core psychological need we discussed with Frank Knight, the need for control in a radically uncertain world. By viewing the future not as a chaotic series of random dangers, but as a series of decisions as risks, we give the system a way to rationalize and manage the unknown. If an economic crash is just a random danger, we are helpless victims. But if it is a risk, it means the decision was made by central banks or deregulated traders. And if a decision was made, it means we can analyze it, we can create new policies, we can fire the people responsible, and we can try to make a better decision next time. The language of risk is how modern autopoietic systems digest the terror of an unpredictable future. It converts paralyzing helplessness into manageable action.
But the blind spot there is massive. If an institution, say, a government responding to the post-Crimea geopolitical landscape, views everything as a risk to be managed through policy decisions, they become completely blind to true external dangers. They assume they can manage Putin's actions through sanctions and diplomatic levers. But if Putin is acting outside of their rational framework, he isn't a manageable risk, he's an unpredictable danger. By miscategorizing danger as risk, the system gives itself a false sense of security.
Precisely. Systems are so desperate to maintain their internal logic and their illusion of control that they will twist reality to fit their models. When the model fails, the system doesn't blame the fundamental uncertainty of the universe. It blames bad data or poor risk management.
Wow. We have covered a massive amount of intellectual ground, from Knight's mathematical boundaries to Douglas's cultural tribes to Beck's apocalyptic globalization, Foucault's power dynamics, and Luhmann's communication systems. How does Stefan Popov pull all of this together? What is the synthesis?
Popov does a masterful job of weaving these diverse theories into a usable, concrete definition for policymakers. But before he gives us the final definition, he looks back at the very origin of the word.
The etymology is fascinating. The word risk likely traces back to the ancient Greek word rhizikon, which translates to a root, a rock, or an underwater reef. It was a term used by early Mediterranean sailors to describe a hidden navigational obstacle. It's the perfect metaphor. A hidden reef is a future threat, it's a danger. But acknowledging that the reef is there is also a warning to take preventative action to steer the ship a different way. It implies a threat, but it also implies the human agency to avoid it.
Building on that ancient metaphor and drawing from the sociologists we've discussed, Popov establishes the prerequisites for risk. Before you can even talk about risk, two conditions must exist. First, you must have uncertainty nights unmeasurable, radical, unknown. The future must be open. Second, you must have danger, the raw external threat that exists independent of you. Only when you combine uncertainty with danger and subject it to human decision-making can the concept of risk emerge.
And here is Stefan Popov's final, distilled definition of risk, built on decades of sociology and his own policy application. He writes, "Risk is the probability of an adverse event relating directly or indirectly to human activity, which is subject to rationalization and management."
Let's break down the key elements of that definition because it perfectly synthesizes our entire discussion. First, it must involve probability. We're attempting to measure it, moving it out of Knight's realm of pure, paralyzing uncertainty. Second, it must be an adverse event. We are focused on the potential for harm, loss, or Beck's distribution of bads. Third, and most crucially based on Luhmann, it must relate to human activity or decisions. If human activity is completely absent, it's merely a danger, an act of nature. And finally, relying on Foucault, it must be subject to rationalization and management. If we cannot manage it, if we cannot create a discursive narrative around it to try and control our population's response to it, it ceases to be a risk and reverts to being a helpless vulnerability.
Okay, let's bring this all back down to earth for you, the listener. We've been on a deep theoretical journey today. We started with Frank Knight showing us that our economic models are often just mathematical boundaries drawn around a terrifying ocean of uncertainty. We traveled through Mary Douglas's Matrix, realizing that what we fear and who we argue with about those fears is dictated by our cultural tribes. We faced Ulrich Beck's Risk Society, where the triumphs of our own industry have become the global, invisible hazards threatening our survival, forcing us into a cosmopolitan reality. We looked through Foucault's lens, seeing how political institutions use the very idea of risk to subtly control our behavior and justify their power. And finally, we explored Luhmann's systems, realizing that calling a tragedy a risk is our modern way of pretending we can control fate.
The overarching takeaway from Popov's work is that risk isn't just a spreadsheet. It isn't just an actuarial table or a military strategy document. Risk is the fundamental architecture of how modern human beings face tomorrow. It is the framework we use to exist in time. So the next time you are assessing a risk, whether you're making a strategic decision at work, investing your savings, voting on a public health policy, or just deciding whether to move to a new city, pause and ask yourself what you're actually doing. Are you dealing with a true risk that is based on your decisions? Are you facing a raw danger from the outside world that you have no control over? Or are you just trying to put a mathematical band-aid on the terrifying radical uncertainty of the universe to make yourself feel better?
It fundamentally changes how you view your own agency. And that leaves us with a final, provocative thought to mull over. We've seen through Mary Douglas that risk assessments are deeply culturally biased. We've seen through Foucault that risk is a narrative tool used for governance. Today, we are increasingly handing over our complex risk assessments to artificial intelligence, predictive policing algorithms, and algorithmic market models.
This is the frontier where all of these sociological theories collide.
Exactly. As we let algorithms calculate our risks for us telling us who is a credit risk, who is a criminal risk, what the geopolitical risks are we actually eliminating risk through superior objective math? Or are we just hard-coding our cultural biases, our systemic blind spots, and our governmental control mechanisms directly into the black box machines that will dictate our futures? If Mary Douglas and Foucault are right, we aren't automating objective truth. We are just automating our own cultural blinders and power structures. It's something to think about the next time an algorithm tells you what the safe choice is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of the unknown. We'll see you next time.